video is about the mother of Emily Dickinson, Emily Norcross Dickinson, also referred to as Emily Sr. She was born on July 3, 1804, in Monson, a rural Massachusetts community 20 miles south of Amherst. Her father, Joel Norcross, was a rich farmer who helped found Monson Academy, a school that admitted females as well as males. Joel believed in the education of his daughters. He had 3 daughters and 6 sons, several wiped out by consumption or tuberculosis, a disease that plagued the family. His first wife, Betsy Fay, would die of it at 51. Emily was the eldest daughter. She was attached to her one surviving sister, Lavinia, born in 1812, a feisty girl who loved to scribble letters and poems. Rich as her father was, Emily Norcross didn't have an easy time at home. Joel had only one servant to care for an enormous barn-like house that had once been a tavern. Most of the chores fell on Emily. Joel took in boarders, and Emily also had to care for them. Her mother couldn't do very much. She was sick a good part of the time. We can imagine how erratic Emily's schooling must have been. She still managed to attend a girls' boarding school in New Haven, Connecticut for several months when she was 19. Connecticut would be the source of her father's second wife. There's no record of her having met Edward Dickinson, her future husband, who was also in New Haven at the time she was at boarding school, about to graduate from Yale. Betsy Fay Norcross died in 1829, and at some point after that, one source says 1830, another says 1835, Joel had the Norcross House built in Monson, Massachusetts. He remarried in 1831 to Sarah Vail, just a few weeks after Emily Dickinson's birth. Sarah became a grandmother figure to Emily, who undoubtedly visited them in this house during her childhood. Reverend Joseph Vaill Jr. was her new stepmother's father. One can imagine how shocking this was for Emily Sr., who had just lost her mother, her siblings, and now she was getting accustomed to a new mother figure. This may account for her coldness recorded by her own daughter, Emily Dickinson, the poet. Some background on the Vail family. In 1778, Reverend Vaill was a graduate of Dartmouth College. He immediately started studying theology and apprenticed with a Reverend Storrs. In 1779, he received a license to preach, and within 3 weeks was approached to preach at the Hadlime Congregational Church at Hadlime, Connecticut. He was installed as their pastor, serving that church for 58 years. During various periods, Reverend Vaill performed missionary work, spending 6 weeks in desolate places such as Vermont, desolate places being his own words. In 1807, he spent 15 weeks in the same endeavor around New York's Black River country. It may be on one of his missionary trips that he would meet his future son-in-law, Joel Norcross. By his 80th birthday in 1831, he had to be replaced by an associate minister, and in 1836 he officially retired from the Hadlime Church to live with his son-in-law and youngest daughter, David and Amanda Vail Everts. Some of Reverend Vail's sermons and essays were published in the Connecticut Evangelical Magazine under nom de plumes of Senex and Jethro. This may be where Emily Dickinson derived some of her love for publishing or trying to publish anonymously. Joel died in 1846 after building the Norcross House in Monson. Aside from its architectural significance as an excellent example of Greek Revival style, the house was prominent in Monson's early history. Joel visited his father's large home and tavern on nearby Cushman Street in the late 18th century in Monson, and Joel was a successful farmer and merchant. They had 9 children. When Joel died in 1846 and Sarah in 1854, the house went to Joel's son Alfred. After Alfred's death in 1888, his son Arthur D. Norcross inherited it. Arthur also attended Monson Academy, And in 1871, he was one of the 27 students in the first graduating class at the Massachusetts Agricultural College, which would later become a part of UMass Amherst. Like the 3 generations before him, he was a prominent Monson citizen, and he served on the Water Commission, the School Committee, the Board of Selectmen, and a number of other town offices. He also represented the town in the State House of Representatives from 1904 to 1906, and the State Senate in 1908 and 1909. Arthur's son, Arthur Jr., was born in Monson in 1895, probably in this house, but he spent most of his life in New York City, where he founded the Norcross Greeting Card Company in the 1920s. He also continued to play a role in Monson, and in 1939 he established the Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary in Monson and the neighboring town of Vail. When he died in 1969, he left much of his estate to the Norcross Wildlife Foundation for the continued operation of the 8,000-acre sanctuary. The old Norcross House is still standing on Main Street and is one of the few surviving examples of a columned Greek Revival home in Monson. In doing research for this video, there was some confusion because there is a Monson in Maine, and Monson, Maine also has a Monson Academy. So while I looked for evidence of the Monson Academy in Massachusetts, I could find evidence of a school that seemed to be associated with other universities, but I couldn't find a standalone Monson Academy. So I'm going to briefly touch on the Monson Academy in Monson, Maine, in case it's relevant. In June 1847, John Rice, Alpheus Davison, and Ephraim Flint, on behalf of 54 incorporators, signed and submitted a petition to establish Monson Academy in the town of Monson, Maine, for the education and improvement of youth. The petition was granted, and in September, a more permanent organization of those 54 stockholders of Monson came about, and construction of Monson Academy began. The building for Monson Academy was built at a cost of $936 and was completed and dedicated in August 1848. The first class of Monson Academy then entered that fall. In March of 1860, this original building was burned to the ground due to a deflective flue in the attic of the school. Construction of a new, larger school began almost immediately. This new Monson Academy was completed in 1861 in time for the fall session to begin under the leadership of Reuben Rideout. In 1872, in accordance with a grant made by the town, Monson Academy was united with the local public school, Monson High School. Monson Academy's school colors are orange and black, and the students became known as slaters, so named for Monson's then primary industry, the slate quarries. Schools back then were of concern to New England families because they would often close in the summer. And we know Monson Academy enrolled girls and stayed open all year round. So if this was the Monson Academy attended by Emily Norcross, it would have been a very, even if it wasn't, it would have been a very attractive option to New England families. From age 17 to 19, she attended the coeducational Monson Academy, which her father had helped to found. She then went to the New Haven, Connecticut boarding school for 1 term. She returned to Monson, Massachusetts, her education over. Some scholars say that her courtship with Edward Dickinson, who was 1 year her senior, began in 1826. Others say that they met in 1828 at a chemical lecture in Amherst. Supposedly, they met on January 1st, 1828, which happened to be Edward's birthday. She was practically an old maid by Monson standards, just 23. Edward was a law student who had to struggle since his father couldn't seem to juggle his own accounts. Samuel Fowler Dickinson was still one of the most prominent men in Amherst. Co-founder of Amherst College, he had unsuccessfully run for Congress. He wanted to bring a law school to Amherst. He would claim that Edward had been the valedictorian of his class at Yale. This was a bald lie. Samuel had to yank his boy more than once from New Haven, and Edward barely had enough time and money to graduate. The squire, as Emily Dickinson's grandfather was called, continued to remain involved with Amherst College, and he sank whatever small fortune he had into paying the school's bills. He lived on loan after loan until there was little to borrow. Did Emily Sr. bond with Edward over their fathers? Emily's having remarried just a few weeks after her own mother's death, and Edward's father living this lifestyle beyond his means. It's not certain. When they met, Edward was a major in the Massachusetts militia, and he hadn't come to Monson to study chemistry, but to preside over a military court. He had to pass judgment over a reckless lieutenant colonel who had vanished from camp. And we have to wonder if Edward was wearing his uniform with its ceremonial sword and slash at the lecture. Is that what caught Emily's eye? But what did Edward see in this silent girl? He must have been bewitched by her. He wrote his first letter to her on February 8th, a month after the lecture, and never stopped writing. But he realized soon enough that Emily Norcross wasn't much of a correspondent. She didn't answer him until March. He had made her aware that he was looking for a bride. He proposed marriage on June 4th, marriage by mail. He received no reply. He wrote to her father, who was just as silent. Joel Norcross wasn't that eager to relinquish a daughter who had become the workhouse of his family with all of his boarders. This accumulation of silences didn't discourage Edward, who continued to press his case like a lawyer and militiaman. But Emily wasn't unmoved. She must have found her suitor's red hair and barrage of long letters attractive. Finally, at the end of October, she agreed to marry him. Over 2 years, they wrote 93 letters to one another, with Edward writing 69 and Emily writing 24. Edward constantly showed his affection for Emily in his letters, where Emily was much more laconic in her replies. She knew that her lack of enthusiasm frustrated Edward and wasn't afraid to let him know it, writing once in a letter, "Frequent repetition of my disobedience I trust will not exhaust your patience, which I think has been faithfully tried." On October 30th, 1826, she accepted his proposal. I'm not sure if it was 1826. I think this was 1828, saying that you may rightly conclude that my feelings are in unison with yours. In 1829, she gave birth to her and Edward's first son, Austin Dickinson. 1 year later, she, Edward, and Austin moved to the homestead, now the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, where their daughters Emily and Lavinia were born in 1830 and 1833, respectively, Lavinia being named for Emily Sr.'s most beloved sister. Her husband's busy career as a lawyer and as the treasurer of Amherst College meant that she often stayed home with her children, which made her feel isolated and lonely. In 1855, she endured a particularly troubling period of depression. She spent most of her time at home, either taking care of her household or tending her garden, which was one of her biggest passions. She suffered a stroke in 1874, from which she never fully recovered, and spent the remainder of her years paralyzed until her death in November 1882. Her own daughter, Emily Dickinson, would only survive her by 4 years. Emily Norcross Dickinson kept an immaculate house and was praised for her cooking. She appears to have had little interest in family conversations on politics, history, and literature, though she was capable, but instead focused on housekeeping and gardening. She is generally credited with instilling in both Emily and her sister Lavinia a love of gardening. The family's roses included a Greville rose in yellow and white that Mrs. Dickinson is said to have brought to Amherst from Monson in 1828 and nurtured at the homestead. It must have been exhausting for Emily Sr. to go from taking care of a house full of boarders in Monson to taking care of a family with children in Amherst. Looking at the timeline, it doesn't look like Emily Sr. had much time to recuperate or rest or anything like that. And we have to remember also that she grew up without her biological mother. And so all of this contributed to Emily Dickinson's upbringing. Mrs. Dickinson was also known for ability with sensitive plants, receiving a commendation from the local paper, The Express, for her delicious ripe figs, a great rarity in New England. She particularly loved roses and was known for her figs, a difficult fruit to grow in the western Massachusetts climate. Although she suffered one severe bout of depression in the 1850s, after she had left visiting Monson, and it seems that this bout of depression was brought about from leaving her hometown, she then regained her physical health and outlived most of her siblings, many of whom had died in infancy. Anyway, Almost a year to the day after her husband's death in 1874, Mrs. Dickinson had a stroke that left her paralyzed. For the next 7 years until her death in 1882, her daughters took care of their mother. Later, the poet wrote of her mother, "When we were children and she journeyed, she always brought us something. Now would she bring us but herself. What an only gift." Both mother and daughter had frequent bouts of melancholy. Both took part in Amherst's most publicized event, the annual cattle show, where they baked pies and bread and served on committees. I believe this cattle show still takes place. Not to the level it once did, but I do know that New England pies are still a huge point of pride in that area of the United States. She still recognized the presence of her mother as she wrote to her cousins Louise and Frances Norcross, "Mother drives with Tim the stableman to carry pears to settlers, sugar pears with hips like hams and the flesh of bonbons." In 1874, she wrote to her friend Higginson, saying, "I always ran home to awe when a child if anything befell me. He was an awful mother, but I liked him better than none." Here she was unkind. Not only didn't she have an actual mother, but the mother she claimed she did have, she gave a male identity. When she wrote this, she was 43, long past her most productive period, as most Dickinson scholars believe. But why did she suddenly parade in front of Higginson, one of her letter bombs, and annihilate her own mother? It wasn't only Mrs. Dickinson who was in her line of fire. In 1873, while both her parents were still alive, she wrote to Mrs. J.G. Holland, one of her most trusted friends, "I was thinking of thanking you for the kindness to Vinnie. She has no father and mother but me, and I have no parents but her." It had to have been more than some momentary crisis. She adored her father and feared him. He was constantly present in her mental and material life. She'd become a creator in her father's house, in that corner room, with her lexicon, her lamp, and her minuscule writing desk. She wrote, "Sweet hours have perished here. This is a timid, mighty room." But the biting remarks to Higginson about her mother would have a scattergun effect. In 1971, psychoanalyst and Dickinson scholar Joan Cody published After Great Pain, The Inner Life of Emily Dickinson, a 500-page study that presents Dickinson as a basket case whose only manner of survival was writing her cryptic and very private poems. Cody argues that Dickinson could never have become a poet without her delinquent mother. She was indeed a motherless child, emotionally abandoned by a woman who was, quote, "shallow, self-centered, ineffectual, conventional, timid, submissive, and not very bright." Cody apparently missed Mrs. Dickinson's years of education. Cody argued Mrs. Dickinson was utterly responsible for her daughter's infantile dependence and compulsive self-entombment. And, says Cody, one is led to conclude that all her life there smoldered in Emily Dickinson's soul the muffled but voracious clamoring of the abandoned child. "I never had a mother," Dickinson said. "I suppose a mother is one to whom you hurry when you are troubled." She was 39 years old when she said this, and in not one of her previous letters to Higginson or any other correspondent had she ever spoken of herself as a motherless child. Nor had she said anything unkind about her mother. She appears in one of Emily Dickinson's very first letters, when she helped save Austin's sick rooster from oblivion. She's a whirlwind of activity, cooking, sewing, gardening, going off to ramble with her neighbors, bringing them baked goods, and she really was so hurried she hardly knew what to do, according to her own daughter. Sometimes Mrs. Dickinson suffered from neuralgia, where one side of her face froze up. And in 1855, after Edward Dickinson moved his family back to the homestead, his father's former house, she fell into a funk that lasted 4 years. But her daughter was just as uneasy about the move. In one of her poems, she wrote, "I am out with lanterns looking for herself." For many critics, Emily Dickinson has remained the madwoman entombed in her own little attic. Even Alfred Habiger, one of her most subtle biographers, believes that Dickinson's great genius is not to be distinguished from her madness. And to her contemporaries, Emily Dickinson may have posed as a madwoman to insulate herself, but became truly a madwoman, a helpless agoraphobic, trapped in a room in her father's house. Whatever theories we may hold about madness in art, or about some great psychic wound Dickinson suffered from her mother or otherwise, a relentless blow that Dickinson herself described, A death blow is a life blow to some who till they died did not alive become. Her letters and poems are not exactly the work of a madwoman or someone trying to cover up their own debilitating terrors and attacks. In a letter to Colonel Higginson, her sister-in-law Sue wrote that Emily hated her peculiarities and shrunk from any notice of them as a nerve from the knife. Why don't we believe her? Dickinson's entire life was a singularity. She could have been one of Melville's isolates, living in the interior continent of her own mind. How else could she have thrived? How else could she have expressed this genius? How else could she have written thousands of poems if not let alone? But Sue had a terrifying need to normalize her friend and sister-in-law, turn her into one more village poet scribbling about unrequited love. She couldn't bear to look at Emily's deep rage and urge to destroy and turning away from Christianity. Dickinson never shrank from any knife. She loved knives. It was her task at Mount Holyoke to clean the knives and collect them, like some kind of knife thrower in the making. She could wound us all with dirks of melody. Mutilation was a central motif in her letters and poems. Here is festival, she wrote to Sue in 1864, exiled in Cambridge for nearly 8 months, while a Boston ophthalmologist dealt with her irritated eyes. Where my hands are cut, her fingers will be found inside. It's one of Dickinson's most disturbing images, as if Sue and Emily were sisters bound together by mutilation. But where had this mutilation come from? Had Emily cut herself, or had Sue crept inside her like some ghoul? There's a lot of bile and savagery in Emily Dickinson's imagery, and perhaps it might help us understand her own sudden, brutal remarks to Higginson about her mother, like a cat breaking into English. Dickinson wasn't a madwoman, but she could be maddened with rage against a culture that had no place for a woman with her own fiercely independent mind and will. Yet her own annihilation of a woman, her own mother, was also about something else. Dickinson had to reinvent herself, or be stifled and destroyed by all of the rituals around her. She was the daughter of the town patriarch and felt it acutely. Some of her biographers believe Dickinson was doomed to become a spinster because she was too uncertain of her attractiveness and too fearful of heterosexuality to consider marriage. That hardly stopped most other women of her class, and it wouldn't have stopped the belle of Amherst if she had truly wanted to get married. I suspect what disturbed her more than giving in to the man of noon was the notion of having to give up the Dickinson name. Maybe she could only become the wife without the sign in some ways. It's difficult to make sweeping statements about Dickinson because she went through different moods in her life, and there are some in which she is very religious, some in which she is not, some in which she's writing feverishly to men, some in which she's not. So it's difficult because she went through different phases in her life. Austin Dickinson was the adored one, the pampered one in the family, and he would perpetuate the Dickinson line. Emily and her sister were not thought of so highly. Her father would school his daughters, send them both to a female seminary, but he never mapped much of a future for them. One could argue he let them map that for themselves. Born into a genteel caste, the two sisters could suffer the tormenting paralysis of women deadlocked by a culture that treated them as both servant and superior. The childish whisper of Emily's wasn't her natural voice. She was a woman with a lot of ambition. For a while she wanted to get her poems published, and then she withdrew from this. She would remain a Dickinson, but parent herself, become a creature of both sexes, original and androgynous, and living through her poetry in a way that she did not live in real life. She lived her life searching for the delinquent palaces of her childhood and her art. We can feel her streak of rebellion when she sympathizes with a maverick student at Holyoke. She had only been there a little longer than a month and was still homesick when she wrote to her brother, "A young lady by the name of Beach left here for home this morning. She could not get through her examinations and was very wild beside." She wrote this in 1847. It was this human wildness that frightened and attracted Emily, a wildness that would haunt the dreamscape of her poems. We never learn what happened to Miss Beach, whether she settled down with a husband or remained a maverick or was cast out, another prince cast out. But Dickinson had to rebel in a much more secret and convoluted way. She manufactured her very own fire through her poetry. One could argue she had to tear apart all ties to her mother, the one creature who, remaining home with her, had done the most to shape her sensibility. Emily Dickinson's own elliptical songs are like a hymn to her mother's repeated silences and melancholy, all of the pauses, all of the dashes. Part of why we don't know a lot about Emily Norcross Dickinson is she suffered from, I don't think she suffered from it, but she didn't like to write. She was not a writer. Vinnie, the daughter who was closest to her, who could knit and sew and clean the house like a dervish, also didn't like to write. But Vinnie wasn't shy the way her mother was. Vinnie loved to flirt. She was also a mime and a reader of books. And she overcame her word blindness enough to write 17 poems that still survive. The fireflies hold their lanterns high to guide the falling star. But if by chance the wicks grow short, the stars might lose their way. Vinnie has almost a kind of fictional glow. We can imagine her and see her in ways that we can't see her sister Emily Dickinson. We don't see Emily Dickinson throwing as much fire towards her father, and this may be because she was taught to respect him in a way that she was not taught to respect her mother. What we see in Emily Dickinson's work is a strange woman. She has the playful ambiguity of a kitten being a tiger. She called herself a scholar and Higginson's gnome. She could crawl under people's skin. She bombarded various people with letters and poems. Various people tried to lure Emily out of the homestead and have her come to Boston, where she could listen to lectures, conversations with other poets, and attend meetings with other women at the aristocratic and exclusive women's club. But Emily Dickinson refused. In 1869, she wrote, "I do not cross my father's ground to any house or town."